Nothing interesting is happening. Nothing at all. And I'm here to talk about completely boring stuff that will never get this channel taken down. Let's just set that up at the beginning, and I think we're good. I'm David Wilcock. I believe our audio works this time. Thank you for being here. And this is The Unveiling, Solar Cycles and Human Transformation. I am so excited about what has happened, and I really do want to tell you about this, so let's go over here for a minute. A phrase was popping up in my mind recently that I remembered, very dimly remembered sometime in the past, maybe in the 1990s, that this particular thing popped up in my transcripts. If you don't already know this, I've written 4 published books now, and 2 of them are on the New York Times bestseller list. So maybe you'll see that in my lower third here. And we have really been describing a spiritual reality. My view of the cosmos fundamentally revolves around this concept of how do we get where we want to go? How do we get where we want to go as a planet? How do we get where we want to go as a people? And to learn the full scope of what is wrong with Earth also gives us an opportunity for a spiritual awakening. So in this episode, I'm going to start to unify some concepts for you regarding this idea of the conscious universe. And specifically, my objective is going to be to talk about the sun and how the sun actually is influencing human behavior. And it influences human behavior so precisely that it's really embarrassing that we don't have any type of common accepted knowledge about why this works and what is it. Why does the sun cause our behavior to go up and down in very precise ways as humans on Earth? It starts to fundamentally redefine what we would think of as free will. Because what you're going to see in today's show is absolute proof that the sun, as it's rising into the high point of the solar cycle, which is an 11-year cycle, on the low end of the cycle, as you're going to see in some images we have here, the sun is very quiet. It's like a still pond. But when the solar cycle gets to its peak every 11 years, the sun's surface is boiling with fire, and it becomes very, very agitated. During this agitation going on with the sun, we also see agitation taking place on Earth in very specific ways that actually, believe it or not, are incredibly quantifiable and incredibly regular. The same stuff has continued to happen over and over again. Now, when you have to come face to face with something like this, it's a very interesting perspective, because if the sun is controlling your behavior, that means that we're not separate from the cosmos. That means that cosmophysical influences or cosmological influences are directly affecting our behavior. And there are analogies that I'm going to give you as far as why I think this is working, and they're related to simple ideas of temperature. If you put enough people in a room and then you lock the doors so they can't get out, and the temperature in the room gets higher and higher, they're going to start to get very, very agitated, wouldn't they? Well, and then whoever is in front of the door, other people are going to move that person out of the way, saying, you don't know what you're doing, let me do it. I know how to open the door. And so you start to get unrest and rioting. So this is a concept that I believe is going to bear fruit, that our consciousness has a temperature. And when long delay, we're going to launch right into this now. So let's go over here. And now I want to talk about the 11-year sunspot cycle's influence on mass consciousness. So let's go to the slide. Okay, so this is just the basic overview of what's going on that we get from Google. And it says, every 11 years or so, the sun's magnetic field completely flips. This means that the sun's north and south poles switch places. Then it takes about another 11 years for the sun's north and south poles to flip back again. Over time, solar activity and the number of sunspots increases. So the basic takeaway from this is that solar activity fluctuates from minimum to maximum over the course of about 11 years. And so this is kind of an older picture from like 1980 to 84 and then all the way up through 2000. So this is one solar cycle where you can kind of see that it goes from boiling rage on the top left, boiling rage on the bottom right once again, and calm in the middle. So this is a view of minimum on the right, which again is very calm, maximum on the left, and again 11 years between these two periods of time. Another view of it, this is 2008 for minimum and 2002 for maximum. And there's another image of it. So another way that they count whether you're in a maximum or not is by looking at the number of sunspots. So you can apply certain filters to the sun and see the sunspots right here. So during maximum, there's a lot of these sunspots. Now, interestingly enough, the Edgar Cayce readings actually say that the sunspots are caused by human beings on Earth disrupting the energy of our solar system. In other words, what they're actually telling us is that the solar system itself requires us to be loving and compassionate in order to be healthy. When we create anger and disharmony on Earth, ultimately it will eventually manifest as things like earthquakes. So the law of one perspective with the living cosmos part involved basically says if there's an area on Earth where a lot of people are very unhappy, very sad, and they're consistently angry, if that goes on long enough, it will attract a volcano or an earthquake to that area. So this is a big problem because other people can drag you down, and you don't want to be in these areas when these disasters occur. Now, it is something that undoubtedly was told to them by extraterrestrials. When you go throughout the Asian cultures, they talk about this concept that if you have a bad emperor, then you get problems and unrest in the land. And so the emperor in that case being kind of an embodiment of the people and their will, which I don't really necessarily think is true. But if things are going bad in a country, a lot of people are going to be angry, and that can create more earthquakes. So the Cayce readings said that the sunspots are caused by human dysfunction. And again, Cayce did 14,000 documented readings where he diagnosed people's medical ailments and then prescribed exotic treatments. Now my face is like really freaking itchy. Can I just itch my face, please? Are you going to be angry at me if I do this? Oh, God. All right, I'm good. So, being off camera for like 3 or 4 minutes made me sweat profusely because I've almost never done that before. But again, my clicker doesn't work, my makeup's screwed up. That's the you got to roll with what you got. You got to go to war with the army you have. Okay, so at the end of the 11-year cycle, back to slide, the sun's magnetic field also goes through a reversal. So solar minimum, you see that you got the green coming out the top and the purple coming out the bottom. When you look at what happens with solar maximum, the green is almost completely gone, and now the purple is coming out of the top instead of the bottom, and the magnetic fields are all messed up. So that's another basic thing, is a magnetic reversal every 11 years. So again, on the right we have the minimum, and on the left we have the maximum. So now we're going to be talking about this concept of the 11-year solar cycle having effects on human beings. We'll go back to camera, yeah. So the effects on humans are really the thing that we're the most concerned about here because this is affecting all of us. And as it turns out, just in December 2019, we have ramped up into a solar maximum. So please bear in mind that all of the interesting things I'm going to tell you about what these solar cycles do to the mass consciousness of humanity. Remember, I said that it's correlated with wars. As the temperature goes up in the room, people get angry because they want to get out, and somebody else is in front of the door and they're like, get out of the way, and that's the kind of idea. When the solar energy goes up, some of what happens it manifests as unrest, but then there's other aspects of what happens that are very, very positive, as we're going to find out. So this idea that the sun is influencing human behavior was discovered by a Russian scientist named Alexander Chizhevsky. So here he is. And he discovered that wars and other types of major human events are peaking in an 11-year cycle. So here's a picture of Chizhevsky as a younger man. Here's another picture of him. And here he is posing in front of the graphs that he was making, where what he's doing is he's looking at sunspot activity and then comparing it to war. And sure enough, as what we're about to see is that these are very correlated. So here he is as an older man, having been through a horrible, horrible life, as you're about to find out. So he is considered a hero in Russia for having discovered this. They even made an official Russian silver coin with Chizhevsky on it. And this is, we're going to see an updated diagram from Roland McCready. He made this of the Chizhevsky data that shows the stunning connection between solar activity and important historical events. Okay, so let's take a look at the graph. This is the overview, and then first I'm going to zoom in on the top, and then I'm going to zoom in on the text on the bottom. So what we're seeing on the top, okay, let's take a look at this. When we look at the top, we see the year 1750, 1770, 1790, 1810, 1830, 1860, 1880, 1900, 1920. Okay, so what we got there is the blue line and the red line. So the blue line says the number of important historical events, and then the red line says the number of sunspots. So what he actually did here is he's quantified the difference between, or the correlation between important historical events and sunspots. Well, how do you gauge important historical events? He literally went through a lot of different historical texts, and he found the events that really did define civilizations, the most significant things that happened all over the world. And one of the things that's really, really bizarre is that these correlations hold up between geographically isolated cultures. So, for example, you can look at Chinese history, which is totally geographically isolated, and then look at European history, and you're going to find that they are both having the most significant historical events at the same time, though there was arguably no contact between these cultures during the earlier periods where this is being seen. So now we're going to zoom in just on the top, where you can see that in even more detail, number of historical events, number of sunspots. It's very, very, very precise. And here's the one on the bottom. So here's the graph where it says solar activity and human activity levels, created from data provided in the translation of Chizhevsky's paper, Physical Factors of the Historical Process, published in 1971. In the graph, the number of important historical events is plotted in blue on top, the number of sunspots plotted below in red. Alexander Chizhevsky constructed an index of mass human excitability published in 1926 in Russian. The histories of 72 countries were compiled and plotted against the sunspot activity from 1750 to 1922. Unfortunately, we don't have any records of sunspot activity prior to 1750. Obviously, this correlation should hold up because it's been consistent since before the dawning of America. It's always been there. Back to the slide. From 1750 to 1922, Chizhevsky found that 80% of the most significant human events occurred during the circa 5 years of maximum solar activity. That's very significant. Wait a minute, let's just stop right there. 80% of all the most significant events in history occurred during solar maximum, during those 5 years. 80%. So the other 6 years out of the 11-year cycle, you only get 20% of historical events. That's a massive difference. It's a massive difference. Back to the slide. He also found that 80% of the most significant human events, which are actually, as you're going to see, positive, during the 5 years or so of maximum activity occurred as well. A solar maximum can increase human warfare activity as well as human creativity. Oh, and I'm just going to read you this one part again. The 80% of the most significant human events occurred during the maximum solar activity across 72 countries, including China. It's all there. And it also raises human creativity. And he talks about this. So in the law of one, they call this a polarization. Now, part of what's interesting is that you get an economic crash somewhere in solar minimum, And this causes everybody to become very angry and very upset. And then the people fight back and defeat the villain during the solar maximum. And there's only 5.5 years between the minimum and the maximum, yet 80% of the most significant human events occurred during these 5 years of maximum solar activity. So this is a very, very curious phenomenon, and it's not going away anytime soon. Next, I want to read you what actual Wikipedia has to say on Chizhevsky. If you look me up, I'm not even in there. I'm not significant enough. So the first thing they do is they change the spelling to have it with a C, so it's Chizhevsky, right? But I'm just going to stick with the other one for the most part. Chizhevsky was born in the town of Ciechanowiec, or Ciechanowiec in Polish, in the Grodno Governorate of the Russian Empire, now Poland. His father was Leonid Vasilievich Chizhevsky, was a Russian military general. In 1915, Chizhevsky spent his summer observing the sun, and he first hypothesized, meaning he made a theory, about the effect of periodic changes in solar activity on the organic world and human behavior. Then in 1916, he got thrown into World War I, which again, try to remember, nobody had ever expected a disaster as big as World War I. There had never been a World War before. There had never been airplanes that could drop bombs on people before. There had never been gas released as a chemical weapon before that could wipe people out in trench warfare. So World War I was really big, really scary, and really deadly. And they didn't even think that there could be another world war after this. That's why they call it the war to end our wars. It was considered so horrible. How could there possibly be another one? And yet there was. So during World War I, he gets thrown in, and now he is in an absolute disaster scenario where his life depends upon how the war is going and how much are people either getting along or not getting along. Okay? So back to the slide. He entered the World War I as a Russian in 1916, fighting on the Galician front, and he earned a Cross of St. George. And when he was in World War I, he observed directly that battles were waxing and waning right in alignment with the strength of solar flares and geomagnetic storms while they were at the height of solar cycle 15. So this is another thing that is easily overlooked in the Chizhevsky research. It's not just solar maximum. It actually gets down to when the solar flares occur and when the resulting geomagnetic storms that are caused by charged particles hitting the atmosphere, when does that occur? So as we get a geomagnetic storm and we get solar flares, all of a sudden the battle heats up when the solar flares are heating up. And again, Casey's readings say that solar flares are the result of sunspots come out of solar flares, right? Or solar flares come out of sunspots. So sunspots are the result of human dysfunction. So wouldn't you know that right as we're at our peak dysfunction, the sun is freaking out, and then people on Earth are having these warlike behaviors. The wars are actually correlated with the solar flares. And again, when your life depends on this and you can predict, what's going to be happening based on how much activity is in the Earth's magnetic field and the sun, that's a very useful thing for your own survival. Back to the slide. So here he is again with his original graphs as he discovered all of this and figured out that, there's an absolutely perfect correlation between solar activity and noteworthy historical events. So then in 1918, he graduated from the Moscow Commercial Institute with a degree in archaeology. His Moscow State University Doctorate of Philosophy thesis was called On the Periodicity of the World's Historical Process. So periodicity means that events are going to repeat over and over again the same way in the same times. It's periodic. It keeps happening. And the historical process for the whole world. So he's finding a cycle in history. So he would later call his viewpoint heliotaraxy or heliotaraxia. In 1942, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin became aware of Chizhevsky's research work, including physical factors of the historic process. Chizhevsky was then asked, and remember, this was a communist, fascist dictatorship in Soviet Union, World War II, right? And this is right at the peak, 1942, right in the peak of World War II. So Stalin was very proud of the Russian Revolution of 1917. and believed that it was totally the result of people on Earth working on their own, that it would have nothing to do with anything like the sun influencing the behavior of Russians. So when Stalin found out that this man Tijevsky was saying that sunspot activity was driving human behavior, including the Russian Revolution, for them, they couldn't handle that. You know, they were very proud of communism. They were very proud of their revolution and how it came about. They did not want to hear that it came from the sun. So now back to the slide. Stalin asked Tijevsky to retract his writings on solar cycles, which contradicted their own theories of why they had revolutions in 1905 and 1917. Tijevsky refused, and he was arrested, and he spent 8 years in a forced labor gulag, read concentration camp, in the Ural Mountains. Okay, gulag's the same thing. It's a prison camp. He wasn't released until 1950. Can you imagine? Just try to imagine that you discover this really cool stuff back in 1918, okay, and you've changed the world. You've discovered this really cool new science. And then all these years later, in 1942, you get arrested because you won't say that your theory was fake, because these arrogant idiots who are fascists, in this case in Russia, 1905 and 1917, it's all us. It has nothing to do with the sun. This is heresy, you know, or the equivalent of heresy for communists who don't have any religion. So they threw him away for 8 years in a forced labor gulag in the Ural Mountains. Now, the Ural Mountains are like really, really cold. So this is like Siberia. So imagine 8 years on a chain gang in a prison gulag in Siberia. 8 years, just because you won't retract your theory. Okay, and then they continued. Listen to this, watch this. Okay, back to the slide. He was released in 1950, but then he resettled in Karganda, Kazakhstan, where they gave him another 8 years of Soviet rehabilitation, where at least now he doesn't have to do forced labor. He's not in a concentration camp, but they sent him into coal mines. Now, if you've ever heard about black lung, I mean, when you breathe coal dust, it gets into your lungs and it can be incredibly lethal. So a coal mine is probably one of the most deplorable places to work. Now, theoretically, he was doing scientific research in the coal mine, but you can obviously tell, once again, this was some sort of punishment. So he was never deterred. He did the time, and in fact, even after those 8 years, there was additional imprisonment that seems to have occurred after that, and there's some scholarly dispute as to how long was he in the prison camps, but definitely 8 years of hard concentration camp physical labor, 8 years in a coal mine, scientific research, but you're breathing coal dust. It's very, very nasty. And he never, ever gave up. He never said that this was false or that he made it up. He continued to the very end to assert that this was true. So imagine a human being suffering this much for their belief in science, which again wasn't a belief, it's a fact when you can prove it. Let's go see now more slides. So Tijevsky proposed that not only did geomagnetic storms result from, let me read it the right way. Tijevsky proposed that not only did geomagnetic storms resulting from sunspot-related solar flares affect electrical usage, plane crashes, epidemics, and grasshopper infestations of all things, but also human mental life and activity. Now, his theory was that it was caused by negative ions in the atmosphere that made us more excitable. But let's just look at this really quickly. So electrical usage, meaning how much electricity do we want to use? I guess when we're freaking out in solar maximum, we use more electricity. Plane crashes suggests that this solar energy could somehow disrupt machines in some way. Epidemics, we're going to talk about this a lot more. Grasshopper infestations is another really weird one, right? Why would that happen? Well, we don't really know. But human mental life and activity. Okay, that's going to be a very interesting one. Tijevsky proposed that human history is influenced by 11-year peaks in sunspot activity, triggering humans en masse to act upon existing grievances and complaints through revolutions, revolts, civil wars, and wars between nations. So revolutions are actually usually going to be a good thing. They change things up, and they get rid of entrenched bureaucratic power structures. Back to the slide once again. He analyzed sunspot records and approximated records, comparing them to riots, revolutions, battles, and war in Russia and 71 other countries for the period of 500 BC to 1922 AD, a process known as historiometry. He found that a significant percentage of what he classified as the most important historical events, remember 80%, involving large numbers of people occurred around solar maximum. So riots, revolutions, battles, and war. Now this is where it gets even more interesting. Edward Dewey, the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles, analyzed and published his data in 1951 in the Foundation's publications. Dewey was heavily influenced by Chizhevsky's stunning data, and his goal was to further understand and extend this knowledge. He wanted to know, was the knowledge still working after Chizhevsky's time? Obviously that'd be a big question. 1951, if Chizhevsky only got it up to maybe 1918, is it still going to work? So Dewey got his hands dirty and dove in there and got it done. So here's his picture, going back to the slide. And here's the title of his paper, which is Discovering and Predicting Cycles in Nature and Economics. So in a 1971 book, Dewey described that there are 4 components of the 11-year solar cycle discovered by Chizhevsky, and each of their approximate lengths. So you divide it up into 4 sections, 4 compartments, if you will. Okay, so here's the title of the book, Cycles, the Mysterious Forces that Trigger Events. And again, this was all derived off of Chizhevsky, but just to not to blow over Dewey too quickly, Dewey discovered other cycles besides the 11-year sunspot cycle, and some of them we still don't really know what they are. But there's a lot of interesting and mysterious stuff going on to look at here. Okay, so let's now talk about the 4 different periods of time that Chizhevsky discovered working in this 11-year sunspot cycle. Here we go. The first period is 3 years long, and it's characterized by minimal solar activity. During this time, the people on Earth, and again, he studied 72 countries, and everybody's doing this, right? They're all having the same effects. They're passive, and they have autocratic, like a dictatorship type of rule, okay? Then, in the next phase number 2, the masses are now getting angry. They begin organizing under new leaders in one theme, and that takes place over 2 years. Then you dump right into this maximum excitability, revolution, and war, and this takes place during 3 years of solar maximum, so there's a peak. Okay, the 3 years, according to Dewey, is when this happens the most. So I did say 5 years before, but it's the most significant point is 3 years, and this is your solar maximum. Now remember, our solar maximum started, as I'm going to show you proof of this, it started at the end of it started at the end of December 2019. So the 3 big years are 2020, 2021, and 2022. And we're already most of the way through 2021 now. So 80% of the most significant events take place during this time. And again, maximum excitability, revolutions, and wars. What happens in the final period? Gradual decrease in excitability until the masses once again become apathetic, and this takes place over 3 years. So this is, again, the concept of how we have, the wheel of karma, which I talked about last week, that you start at the top and you rotate through the wheel, and as you go down, you're having bad karma and you fall into the dark night of the soul. And the law of one says that this will continue happening. You're going to continue collapsing and having these dark nights of the soul until the wheel gets to the top and stays there because you've learned forgiveness. So we as a planet also have the potential to get off of this wheel of karma if enough of us can learn forgiveness, and that's a major, major part of fourth density. The law of one always kind of puts forgiveness and understanding together. They don't always do that, but they do that fairly often. So forgiveness and understanding. Understanding others is what leads to the ability to forgive them. Understanding how they got the way they are can be very helpful in getting you to let go of what's been going on. So Edward Dewey did this research. Where am I? Oh, we're on slide. Okay. So Dewey did this research, and And this is very fascinating stuff. And then it was replicated later on by another guy named Dr. Putilov. So Dewey questioned Chizhevsky's theory because in Chizhevsky's data, the sunspot cycle height lagged about a year ahead of the mass excitability index. Isn't that interesting? So the mass excitability starts before the sunspot cycles, right? Or no? Yeah, it did. So that implies that like whatever is happening to the sunspots, even before we actually see the sunspots, the human excitability starts ramping up before then. So there's something deeper involved than just the visible manifestations of sunspots on the sun. In 1992, Arkady A. Putilov, a researcher in animal and human physiology, published a paper empirically testing Chizhevsky's hypothesis, analyzing events described in Soviet historical handbooks. And this is Dr. Putilov. Putilov found the frequency and polarity of events, including revolution, is the highest in the years of the solar cycle maximum. Remember, there's 3 in the Dewey cycle, and the lowest in the year before the minimum. So we're going to keep going through this, but the next thing that we want to ask ourselves is, okay, when did we hit the solar minimum? Now remember, solar minimum is actually defined as the lowest point, the very, 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 very end of when the sun doesn't show activity. Not the beginning, but the end. So you have to look at the sun, you have to see the sun not doing anything. And this has been going on throughout the late years of this decade, right? We've seen the sun not doing much of anything. And I was wondering, like, when is the sun going to start ramping up again? We didn't really know. So, but solar minimum, again, is defined as kind of like the last moment right before solar activity starts ramping up. So solar minimum is that point. So here we go. We have just now started the next cycle. This is right off of Google. Solar cycle 25 is the current solar cycle pattern of sunspot activity. It began in December 2019 with a smooth minimum sunspot number of only 1.8 sunspots across the entire surface. And solar cycle 25 is expected to continue until about 2030. Okay. So what it says right here, the start date is December 2019. So again, the minimum, the lowest activities in the year before the minimum, so we have 2019, like we said. That's the end of the minimum, is the year that you demarcate. Okay, so now we're going to get into more scientific research that I think you're going to really like. In 1996, the Professor Sweetbert Ertel of psychology from the University of Göttingen corroborated a substantial relationship between solar activity and revolutionary behavior. So once again, he followed up on Chizhevsky by looking at the statistical analysis of a master index of violence from below for the period of 1700 to 1985. So now we're going to find out, okay, is Chizhevsky still right, or did it all fall apart? So here's an image of Professor Ertel, and we're going to read a little more from his papers later on, but the quick answer is yes, he found that it works. Before we go into all of Ertel's stuff, though, I want to talk about another guy who I was reading heavily back when I first got online in the late 1990s. He was studying Edgar Cayce's readings and equating them with the Earth change disaster prophecies that Cayce was always talking about. So that's Michael Mandeville, where he would look at Cayce's disaster prophecies and then analyze trends in the real world that correlated with them. So, for example, Mandeville is where I discovered that the overall amount of earthquake activity has risen on Earth by 400% at least, just by looking at earthquakes that are 2.5 magnitude and higher, which doesn't have anything to do with adding more seismic stations around the Earth. In other words, there's enough seismic stations from whenever this period of time that he started at began, and I think it was somewhere in the early 20th century. And so even back then, any 2.5 or higher, no matter where it is on Earth, there's enough stations that you know where it is. So you know that you're not going to get more 2.5s and above, unless there was a global effect causing this to happen. Well, in fact, Mandeville found a 400% increase in earthquakes. You can't explain that. You can't explain that with global warming. Fossil fuels and us driving cars that pollute the atmosphere shouldn't make the Earth have more earthquakes. This is some kind of internal pressure and heat thing with the Earth, why in the world would it be correlated with what we're doing with industrial emissions? You know, you can't possibly try to tell me that more CO2 in the atmosphere is going to disproportionately cause all these extra earthquakes to happen, and they're going to increase by 400%. It's ridiculous. So clearly something else is going on. And then another thing that Mandeville did that was equally impressive was in 1993, the geologists did a big meta-analysis of volcanic eruptions going back to 1875. And once again, about half of all the volcanoes in the world have been continually monitored since 1875. So that's the only volcanoes we're looking at, is about half of them. So from 1875 to 1993, there's an over 500% increase in the activity of those volcanoes, the 50% or so that we've had studied since then. 500%. And again, how in the world are you going to try to say that CO2, carbon dioxide, is going to make volcanoes blow up 500% more? I mean, somebody's going to try, right? Somebody's going to say, oh, well, you know, the Earth is heating up from the inside because we're heating it up from the outside. Not to this extent. This is ridiculous. It's something else. And I've always been talking about interplanetary climate change because these effects we see on Earth are mirrored throughout the entire solar system. They are not unique to the Earth. This is actually a very, very common thing that's happening throughout our entire solar system. So specifically now, because Mandeville did a lot of great stuff, I want to focus on his solar cycle predictions because that was another thing that he studied. And in 2003, back to the slide, studying Krzyzewski and studying all these other guys, he wrote a paper called The Coming Economic Collapse of 2006. Well, he wasn't quite right? It was 2008, but he's basing this on sunspot activity. And it says right there, sunspot cycles and their influence on human history, right? The Coming Economic Collapse of 2006, exactly. Mandeville was studying Krzyzewski, and he expected that as we headed into this period of 2006 to 2008, and he does indicate there's a 2-year window, and I'll show you that we would expect an economic collapse based on nothing more than the prediction from Krzyzewski. So he wrote it in 2003. He didn't quite get the year right, but the theory, as you saw on the slide, is that it's going to come along with the right cycles of solar activity, and it totally worked. So this is science. You know, when somebody predicts something and then it comes true, that's predictive analysis, and that's exactly what we want in science. So here is the actual paper, okay? michaelmandeville.com, blah, blah, blah. You can go type that in. A.L. Krzyzewski, so this is his article. A Russian professor of astronomy and biological physics noticed during World War I that particularly severe battles followed solar flares and geomagnetic storms, as we heard. Since the sunspots were in a peak period during 1916 to 17, no doubt the war and its various battles were heavily stimulated by the energies that are boiling off of the sun. World War I, right? Intrigued by the connection of human behavior to solar physics, Krzyzewski constructed an index of mass human excitability through, again, what they call historiometry. He compiled the histories of 72 countries from 500 BC to 1922 AD, and 80% of the most significant events, mostly related to war and violence, occurred during the approximate 5 years or so of sunspot activity. And again, with Dewey's analysis, Edmund Dewey, he got it down to 3 years. So again, 2020, 2021, 2022. So by the time we're through 2022, the most intense stuff should have ended. But what does this mean? It's like a revolutionary change. It transforms society, and you're going to read more about this now. Krzyzewski went on to observe that the 1917 Russian Revolution occurred during the height of the sunspot cycle. Unfortunately, this was one of science's most costly observations. According to Mandeville, we got 16 years already because 8 plus 8, but Krzyzewski spent almost 30 years in Soviet prisons because his theory challenged the fascist Marxist dialectics of the era. Wow, 30 years. I mean, imagine, like, Krzyzewski is probably one of the most punished scientists in history for how badly he was attacked by his own government for making a discovery that's really interesting and actually useful, right? If this is what's happening, wouldn't you want to be able to know when these things are going to happen so you can anticipate them? Absolutely. So here's Mandeville's graph. And what he's doing is he's looking at sunspot cycles from 1749 to July 2003, average monthly count. And so this would be the number of sunspots, as you can see on the y-axis, and then the dates on the x-axis. And it says most major human conflicts are easily correlated to the peaks in the count of sunspots, and so are major weather disturbances, including severe droughts and floods. Well, this is another thing Mandeville did a lot of work on, proving that connection. So droughts and floods. Why would there be too much water or not enough water as the solar activity is at its peak? Well, it's because probably weather systems are now on the move and they're doing a lot of unusual things because the Earth is getting more energized as the sun is getting more energized, right? And then people are getting more energized, which is why when there's a solar flare or geomagnetic storm, Chizhevsky, as he's there on the battlefield in World War I, is actually seeing the battles rise and fall as the sunspots are moving. Now here's the next graph. This is 1926 to 2003, in which sunspot cycles are now correlated with depressions or recessions. So when you look below the top headline, you see that the gray lines are indicated to be recession years. That's in the rectangle up near the top. It says recession years, sunspot monthly average, and then smooth the predicted curve. So recession years are the gray windows, the gray bars. And it says compiled from international sunspot count in 2003. Predicted values of 03 to 09 are by IPS Agency of Australia as of July 2003. So that's how he's able to graph ahead of where they think it's going. But again, as you look at this in more detail, what I want you to see here is all these vertical lines, and then you notice that some of the vertical lines are gray bars. Each of those gray bars is a recession or depression. And sure enough, it's absolutely perfectly correlated with the solar activity. Right as the solar activity is peaking, you get these recessions or depressions. And the conclusion is that the sun is bad for business. But, you know, if you can handle the energy, you can actually do a lot of good with it. And I want to make that point too. And we will as we go on. But this is very, very amazing, isn't it? And one of them is at the bottom, right? So solar minimum caused one of them. Right after between 1931 and 36 down in the bottom left, but everything else is at the maximum. And this is all after, right? I mean, this whole graph, for the most part, yeah, it's all after Chizhevsky did his work. So Chizhevsky went to prison for 30 years to predict this graph. And none of this stuff had happened yet, but everything that he discovered came true. And so why don't we talk about this guy? Because then we'd have to deal with the fact that we live in a conscious universe and that the consciousness of the universe is also interfacing with our consciousness. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in, and we're going to see 91 and then the 2000 to 2003. So isn't it interesting that right in the middle of the peak of the sunspot activity, we get 9/11, and then we get the corresponding economic collapse that resulted from 9/11. There it is. And you can see it right there. So 2000 through 2003, and even notice 2000, June 2001, there's actually a dip in the sunspot activity, and then it starts ramping back up again right into 9/11. So right as 9/11 occurred, we're right at the peak of the sunspot cycle. That's exactly what Chizhevsky told us to expect. 9/11 lands right on the money with Chizhevsky's data. It's incredible. Okay, next slide. So he says, how strong is this historical connection between major economic downturns and sunspot cycles? He says we can learn more about this connection of sunspots to economic downturns by directly graphing them together in chart 103 above. Quite clearly, chart 103 shows us there is a strong connection between major recessions and peaks of sunspot cycles, as we were just looking at. It's the same thing again. As can be seen in the graph, there is a decidedly strong parallel between recessions and peak sunspots. It has been consistent throughout most of the century, and again, Chizhevsky had it all the way back to 500 BC, with the hypothetical sunspot activity going on, his 11-year cycle, with one notable exception, as we were just talking about. The bottom year of the Great Depression in 1932-33 also happened at the bottom of the sunspot cycle. So that's not normal, but it can happen, apparently, because that's the data. The collapse of the stock market, however, paralleled right on the nose with the peak of the solar cycle in late 1929. Now, the peak of the solar cycle in late 1929, right as it hit the peak, in fact, let's go back and look at that. If I can do it, hold on. Yeah, so we're looking at this graph now. On the bottom left, we see 1926 and 1931. So right there, where it's 1939, that's the peak of that particular cycle of solar activity. And again, we get the crash, the stock market crash of 1929. So right on the peak of the solar cycle, 1929, we get the collapse of the stock market, just like we saw in 9/11, just like we're seeing since 2000 when this all started to happen again, right? I mean, we've already had a huge economic problem because, COVID started right at the beginning of 2020, which is exactly when solar maximum began, okay? It's very, very amazing. Very, very amazing. Stock prices slid as sunspot numbers slid and the economy wallowed as sunspot counts reached zero. We may be paralleling the 1929 and 1933 era now, and he was again saying it was going to happen, a crash in 2006. There is probably a strong tendency in this era to continue to slide after the bubble break in 2000 for a few years, until all the speculation is squeezed out of the stock prices. From the bears, we already know this means stock prices generally must fall yet another 35 to 75% from their levels in June 2003, depending upon the industry and the company. And he's exactly right. It was a massive crash. He just didn't quite get the year right, but he knew what was going to cause it, and it would be solar activity. So here he goes. This will eventually probably be the outcome of the current 25-year-long depression cycle, and we are likely to catch up with this inevitability in 2006 and 2007. Now, here's the thing you may not realize. We always say 2000 economic collapse, but if you actually look it up, it's the financial crisis of 2007 to 2008. The financial crisis of 07 to 08, known as the global financial crisis, was a severe worldwide economic crisis. Prior to the COVID-19 recession in 2020, it was considered by many economists to have been the most serious financial crisis since the Great Depression. Blah, 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 blah. But here's the thing. All of the failures, the failures that led to this catastrophic thing in 2008, all those failures that were in hindsight very visible and very predictable, started in 2007. You can research this if you want. So the crash was acknowledged, it was starting to happen, and it was written about, but it didn't really ramp up until 2008, which is consistent with the sunset cycle too. At the beginning, you might not get the highest energy. You got to kind of let it ride for a while, okay? So in short, you just saw Mandeville predict a financial crisis starting in 2007, and that it would be massive, 35 to 75% reduction. And it was massive. It was the biggest one since the Great Depression. This is because this science is real and it's true. So I just showed you somebody who predicted it in advance, right? I'm not having the comfort of being after the fact and saying, oh, let's go back and look. No, I'm saying people were seeing this. They predicted it in advance, and he was only off by 1 year, okay? Because the sun keeps kicking our ass. Because again, 80% of the most significant human events occur during this circa 5 year of maximum solar activity, which again, Dewey said is only 3. So we got 2020, 2021, and 2022. So it's right around the corner. Now, regarding this concept that the sun influences our consciousness, the galactic center is just a group of stars. And so some very, very cool stuff happens when we're aligned with the galactic center. And this was done by Dr. James Spottiswoode. Here's a scientist who compiled all this information about people who are ordinary folks being studied in the lab to see if they have ESP and psychic ability. And what he found was he was trying to find if there was a time of the day when people are more psychic. So what do you have to do in a meta-analysis? You have to take a bunch of different data sets and then you have to calibrate them to a standard index of measurement, right? So however psychic people are, based on how well they score in these little tests, and this includes things like Zener cards, where you're trying to guess 1 out of 5 shapes on a card. And there's other examples too. There was Gonsfeld, where you put these ping pong balls over your eyes and you float in a flotation tank in the dark. And then people had psychic experiments that were done in there. Lots of stuff. They did micro telekinesis experiments where people would try to affect the behavior of balls that are dropped through a little matrix of pins inside a little thing where they're going to fall into one of however many slots, like let's say 12 slots. And which slots the balls fall into, they had people try to psychically affect and have more balls fall into one of the slots, and it actually works. Regular people, believe it or not, and there's a lot of parapsychology, they've done this one, they've replicated it extensively. Ordinary people who don't think they have telekinesis can control where the balls go. Okay? And so those are the kind of like the three biggest ones. You got Zener cards, Gonsfeld, and the ball test. But there's a bunch of other ones too. So anyway, depending on how well your telekinesis works and you're trying to get the balls to fall into this one slot, let's give it a scale of 1 through 10. How well are you getting the balls to go into the right slot? Okay? Now he's trying to find out, he's got 20 years of data, all the data, all the most professional, reputable psychic data that was studied in the lab and peer-reviewed, replicated, all the things we want to see, okay? Is there a time of day where people are more psychic? Could it be high noon, for example? What if, right, we don't know, what if the sun is higher, it's right overhead, high noon, right? It's aligned with you, due directly overhead. Could you become more psychic? Is there some kind of lensing effect between the Earth and the sun? And he really worked hard to try to find that. And the answer was no. There was no correlation with what time of day the sun is at, whether it's at high noon or wherever. However, he did find a correlation that lines up every day. But the correlation, believe it or not, is not the alignment with the sun. It was the alignment with the center of the galaxy. This is true. The center of the galaxy. Wow. So when he was aligned with the center of the galaxy, he had, this is called sidereal time. The way that you study where we are in our galaxy and where our Earth is relative to the center of the galaxy, what's our exact position, right? Well, you could say, well, wouldn't it just be the same as our position relative to the sun? No, because our solar system is also revolving around the center of the galaxy. Therefore, you drift by 4 minutes a day. So sidereal time, or local sidereal time, LST, not to be confused with something else that sounds very similar, LST is going to be 4 minutes off per day. So if you figure out a particular time for sidereal time, you're going to have to calculate it the next day and the next day and the next day, because it's going to drift by 4 minutes a day. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Now, check this out. What we're seeing in this graph is how psychic people are across this, 20 years of data of people being telekinetic and controlling which slot the balls fall into. And how well can they use telekinesis, and how well can they be telepathic? But what we're seeing here on the bottom X graph is local sidereal time in hours, right? So you got 0 to 24, so it's a military time. So that's the time in a 24-hour period. And then you have the effect size, which goes from negative 0.2 up to 0.6. So 0.0 is actually like where you're not psychic at all. You have no performance, anything above the norm on these tests. And if you notice, there's actually one point at 18 and a half hours local sidereal time where your psychic ability will be worse. It will be worse than average. It will be worse than 0. All right, look at the graph again real quick and then click back to me. Right there at 18 hours, 18 and a half, it's worse. So if you know this and you're going to try to do something psychic, like let's say you're going to try to, do readings like the ones that I did, if you're going to monkey around with that, and again, please don't believe everything you're getting. Like, that's the biggest problem I see when people try this technique, is that they just think that everything they said is the word of God, and that's not true. This is similar to remote viewing. You want to create data. You don't want to necessarily be attached to your data. You got to go back to the data later and then see, does this data hold up as I look at it later on? And so, like with my own readings, I can easily tell that sometimes I had a stronger connection, sometimes I had a weaker connection. And so the stronger connection readings are the ones that I'm going to read you now because I've ended up in this crazy, crazy time loop. But anyway, going back to the graph again, what we're seeing is, again, 0, 0 is the line in the middle. That's the baseline. Good enough because almost everybody is performing better than average. So they are getting psychic results. But then look at this huge, huge spike where it goes all the way up to 0.5, which is probably, this is probably standard deviation. So it's 5 standard deviations above the mean. That's insane. It's very, very massive effect. In fact, just by kind of roughly calculating it, going between the 0.1 line, which is kind of like where most people are normally parked throughout the day. So 0.1, you go from 0.1 to 0.5. That's a 400% increase in your psychic ability, caused by nothing more than your position, your alignment with the galactic center. So if you have any type of smartphone, there should be free apps that you can get to find out what time it is in local sidereal time. Now, I don't know what time it is right now because I haven't calculated it. But if you look for the ramp up, let's go back to the graph real quick. So if you want to be the most psychic or have the best telekinesis or whatever the heck you're trying to do, if you're trying to communicate with your higher self, meditate, gain insights in meditation, telepathically, whatever, you're going to get a lot better results if you start around, 13 hours local sidereal time, 13 o'clock or thereabouts, so that you can see there's a period from about 12:30 to like 14 hours where it really, really peaks. So if you want to experiment with this and try this out, you'll probably discover some interesting things happening. This is the best time to meditate. This is the best time to pray. This is the best time to try to get things done. So again, the reason why I bring that to your attention is to hypothesize why this might be occurring. The center of the galaxy, in my view and in the law of one view, and typical scientists say, oh, well, there's a black hole in the center of the galaxy and it's right behind this huge cluster of stars in Sagittarius. But we've never seen the black hole right behind the huge cluster. I don't think there is a black hole in the middle of the galaxy. That's just an old theory. What we actually do see is a huge mass of stars in the geographic center of the galaxy, right? Okay. So when we're on Earth, let's just imagine now that we're standing on Earth. Okay, so here's the Earth. This is the horizontal plane of the Earth, and then you're standing on the Earth, right? As the Earth is tilting in relationship to the galactic center, right? At a certain point, it's this hand, I can't even tell. At a certain point, let's say my face is the galactic center, right? So here we are, and we're going through 24. Is this funny? Everybody's probably laughing. Okay, I'm trying to figure out which hand is which, and it's not working. So as we're rotating, and then my face is the galactic center, you're going to come into alignment with it, right? And at this point, let's just say there's like a beam or a conduit of energy that's coming from the galactic center. So as you're in this right position on Earth, I can't figure this out. Whatever. When you're on the right position on Earth, it's as if you're, like, let's say you have a hairdryer, right? And I'm holding a hairdryer, and I go, and I just do that. You're going to feel the burst of heat when I'm aiming it at you, and then as it goes away, you're not going to feel it. Well, instead of that burst of heat and it being a hairdryer, let's say it's the equivalent of a burst of energy from the galactic center. So when you align with it, it's your consciousness. See, this is when the law of one says Jesus is the galaxy, it's actually a conscious being. And when you're in alignment with this brain, the center of the galaxy is part of your brain, okay? I'm actually going to say that. We are not separate beings. This is what the law of one teaches us. We are part of a conscious universe, and our position in the galaxy makes us more psychic because we're more aligned with the mind that we're actually using. When we think, we're using the galactic mind, right? That's a very, very abnormal concept, and it's not something that most people are ready to accept. However, all you have in the center of the galaxy is a group of stars. This is an empirical effect. It's been scientifically verified, it's been replicated through other studies, and it held consistent for more than 20 years with everyone, regardless of, they're not trained psychics, these are ordinary people. And they're able to do things like make balls fall into the right slot of a machine as it's supposed to be just a random falling as it hits these pins. How are we doing that? Well, it has something to do with the galaxy. It has something to do with the sun, because the center of the galaxy is just a group of suns. So the sun is actually causing revolutions to occur, which are healing events, right? This four-part formula that Dewey discovered makes everything work out. And if we didn't become apathetic again after we won the war, then we could just stay on the top of the wheel of karma and not have to keep suffering. And that may be what's going on now on Earth. This cycle that we're going through, according to the law of one, is the final stand for the negative on Earth. There is no more negativity on Earth after this. So as crazy and as horrible and as wild as everything looks right now, and again, basically, when you look at Chejevsky's research, this intensity is going to continue all the way through next year. So even if we get something like mass arrests or trials, don't expect the intensity to go down for another year or so. I would say to make it 5 years is probably a little bit too long, but definitely the intensity will keep burning as hot as possible right through next year. So now I want to say, okay, where are we now in our solar cycle? And can we actually quantify this? Because this is going to be very important, right? Well, let's look up the old Farmer's Almanac, because they got into great detail on this. This is March 4th, 2021. So we are now in solar cycle 25. Record keeping of solar cycles began in 1755 in solar cycle 1. In December 2019, sunspot numbers hit solar minimum and rock bottom. So December 2019. And that's what she says right here. Okay, so I'll show you that. And then back up a little bit. So, and then the solar maximum or peak is predicted to happen in July 2025. Okay, so we're going through this ramp up to solar maximum. And as soon as we hit the minimum and all this stuff, all the research we've seen, all these guys that went through, basically... Okay, so this is another important point, right? Once you hit the minimum, that's where the economic collapse occurs. We've been through all that stuff, and then it ramps up in the 3-year period, and that's where you get the revolutions. So again, they were just saying that the new solar cycle, as it starts to ramp up, started in December 2019, and it's expected that we'll hit the peak in July 2025. Now, what's really, really interesting about this is that I had a dream in this time loop that I'm going to be sharing with you in just a minute, that actually directly gave us a date in a curious way of 2026. And it did this by giving me a date that was one cycle behind that, and I know what the cycle is. And I'll have to talk about this later, because it's too complex for a show that I want to keep to 3 hours. And we're at the halfway point. Okay, so back to the slide. In December 2019, the sunspot numbers hit the solar minimum and rock bottom, and the sun passed from cycle 24 into 25. And solar minimum is exactly when this century-old research predicts an economic collapse. But what happened immediately after December 2019? We all know, don't we? And that's exactly when I finished my book, The Awakening in the Dream. I finished it in January 2020, right as all this scary stuff is happening. And there's film of people just falling over, apparently dead of this thing in China. They just drop over, and I'm looking at this and I'm going, well, how long is it going to take for that crap to spread over here? But I also didn't want to be negative, and I didn't want to think that would happen. But yeah, you could already see where it was going in January, because they were already having a big, big, big crisis going on in China. So what happened after 2019, back to the slide, is that these lockdowns have ruined the economy right on time, and it's still not over. Now, these pandemics are also directly linked to solar activity. And once again, Dr. Sweetbert Ertel from the University of Göttingen, one of his papers in 1994 is correlating the sunspots with influenzas. Wow, okay. So that's one paper that he wrote that shows the correlation. And here's another paper much more recently where somebody's attacking him and trying to say that none of this is real. But the skeptical stuff that she comes up with, I don't think holds up at all. And he actually refuted it. So anyway, I'm going to read this. Using these data, other researchers have attempted statistical analyses to verify the purported association between influenza pandemics and sunspots. And again, this is the skeptic. This analysis examines the work of researchers who claim to verify the sunspot pandemic effect. Ertel, Tapping et al., and Jung. Two of the analyses claim that maxima and sunspot activity are associated with influenza pandemics, while another claims that both maxima and minima in sunspot activity may be associated with pandemics. A brief synopsis of each analysis is given below. So maxima and minima may cause this. And that's, honestly, like, now that we're seeing that the sun is controlling human behavior, why wouldn't it also be able to make these things happen? Because these are disruptive events that fall in line with the timeline the sun is giving us. When we get into the maximum activity, we get all the most chaos, and we have to kind of push through that at the tail end of minimum as we ramp up into maximum. So right here, again, Dr. Ertel has claimed that both maxima and minima in sunspot activity are associated with pandemics. So in these cycles of history, the four-part unit of dividing up the 11 years that we saw from Dewey, those 11-year cycles in 4 sections, you have an economic collapse and you have a pandemic kind of thing, and then that leads to revolution. But, as I've been saying, this is the first time that our entire planet is experiencing the exact same cycle effects. So the end of solar maximum, as we said, is in July 2025, and 80% of the most significant events related to war and violence occurred during these 5 years. However, there's a positive side to this, again from Roland McCready. And so this is his paper on coherence from 2010. And he said, and this is based on real scientific research, which he's then citing the work of Hallberg in 2000 and 2008. Our own human physiological rhythms, like our respiration, heartbeat, and global behaviors are synchronized with solar and geomagnetic activity. So we're totally linked with the sun. Our bodies, the way we breathe, the way we think, everything. Historically, cultures such as the Egyptian, Hopi, ancient Indian, and ancient Chinese believed that their collective behavior could be influenced by the sun. Yeah. The first scientific evidence of this belief was provided by Chizhevsky, a Russian scientist who noted that more severe battles during World War I occurred during peak sunspot periods. And he conducted a thorough study of global human history and constructed an index of human excitability dating back to 1749. Now, we saw this before. I'm just going to show it to you again. How precisely the historical events are correlated with the number of sunspots. I mean, it's uncanny how accurately these two graphs match each other. And then on again through 1840 to 1920. Since his pioneering work, energetic influxes from solar and geomagnetic fields have been associated with numerous aspects of human health and wellness, both positive and negative. And then he's again giving links, in this case, to Cornelissen, Hallberg, and Otsuka. So numerous aspects of human health and wellness are directly associated with the sun. The scientific community and the media tend to focus on the negative correlations, and this includes how we've been talking about Chizhevsky for the most part up until now, right? Societal conflicts, crime, terrorism, traffic accidents, mortality from heart attacks and strokes, etc. However, the greatest levels of human flourishing also occur during these cycles, as Dr. Ertel calculated in 1998. The greatest levels of human flourishing, the greatest bursts of artwork, the greatest bursts of new music, new dance, new creativity, new scientific discoveries, totally mind-blowing, breakthrough, never-before-seen technological discoveries, which kind of gets into what I'm doing here today, right? So don't only think about Chizhevsky as being that the sunspots only cause negative effects as they ramp up. At the same time that there's this kind of instability and revolution going on in the world, there's a lot of really, really great stuff happening. All the greatest religious advancements, spiritual advancements, scientific advancements, they all happen right during the same period of time. And that's equally important. But as Dr. Ertel said, again, you can see him right here, this is something that we normally don't take seriously. We don't look at the positive aspect of what it's doing here. So here's a paper of his. I believe it's from him. Yeah, it is. Sweetbird Ertel. And this is on Science Frontiers Online, one of the earliest websites online that I found back in '96. They had a lot of cool data on it all the way back then. And they haven't really changed it since then either. Look at the design. It's pretty old.
But I'm going to zoom in on this. So again, the paper is from 1990, as you can see at the top, January, February, number 67. And then if you look at the author's name down at the bottom, it says Sweetbird Ertel. So in 1990, this was published. And let's see, so I've got all that worked out in slides, so we don't have to read it off of that. In a previous paper, evidence has been reported suggesting a link between historical oscillations of scientific creativity and solar cyclic variation. Eddy's discovery of abnormal secular periods of solar inactivity, the Maunder minimum type, offered the opportunity to put this present hypothesis to a crucial test. I said president instead of present. Using time series of flourish years of creators in science, literature, and painting from AD 600 to 1800, it was found that, as expected, number one, cultural flourish curves show marked discontinuities or bursts after the onset of secular solar excursions synchronously in Europe and China. So there again, you get this huge burst of creativity and cultural flourishing in Europe and in China right as the sun starts ramping up. Good stuff, cultural flourishing. During periods of extended solar excursions, which again is like the minimums, I guess, bursts of creativity, painting, literature, and science succeeded one another with lags of about 10 or 15 years, right in conjunction with the solar cycle. And again, I think he's saying extended solar excursion is like a ramp up. It's not clear exactly whether he's talking about the minimum or the maximum here. Let's go back again, just look at that. So he said periods of extended solar excursions, right? So, okay. Solar cyclic variation. So he says abnormal secular periods of inactivity, Maunder minimum type. Right, so inactivity. So maybe we're not going to get all the technology until after we get through the 3 hot years. Because after the onset of these excursions, which I guess means that the sun has calmed down and we've been through the revolution, then you get the burst of science and technology. So that's what we're going to get after, I guess, 2022 and thereabouts, as the sun starts to ramp back down. So we get bursts of creativity in painting, literature, science. And the reported regularities of cultural output are prominent throughout with eminent creators. So if they're an eminent creator, they can be artistic the whole time. But with ordinary professionals, their artistic creativity peaks when the sun allows it to happen. So what he says here then is the hypothesized extraterrestrial connection, in this case from the sun, of human cultural history has thus been considerably strengthened, the extraterrestrial connection to our human history. So it's not just bad stuff, it's also really good stuff, which again fits in with the idea that when we're in alignment with the center of the galaxy, we get this huge 400% peak in our psychic activity. So then Ertel did another paper in 98 that gave even more data on this, called Cosmophysical Correlation of Creative Activity in History of Culture. The regularities in the creation of outstanding works of painting and poetry, as well as scientific discoveries over a period of 1400 to 1800, was estimated quantitatively the occurrence of about a 10-year periodicity, just like the sunspot cycle, of creative activity in West European and in Chinese painting, poetry, and science is shown. Wow. As a rule, the peaks of creative work in China agree with those in West Europe. Since the Chinese civilization was not directly connected with the European one, the effect of a synchronizing external factor, i.e. the sun, is proposed. It is assumed that variations in solar activity serve as this factor affecting people's artistic creativity. This study is based on historical data in painting, poetry, and scientific discoveries from 1400 to 1800. And then we get even more data on this idea from Armstrong Economics. And the paper is called Napoleon War, Sunspots, and Human Excitability, published in 2018. So once again, we're seeing the correlation here with the 11-year sunspot cycle as the jaggedy peaks, and then the number of sunspots there, and then we have the mini ice age, and then that line, I guess, has to do with, in this case, global temperature, or maybe it's just the median average. Yeah, it's the 11-year average. This is what the line says, 11-year average of the sunspots. So that's how you calculate overall how many you got. But this is what I really wanted you to hear. Tchaikovsky did a study on sunspot and human activity. He found that humans responded, even creating wars, as there are swings in sunspot activity. He may be most notable for his use of historical research historiometry techniques to link the 11-year solar cycle, Earth's climate, and the mass activity of peoples. Just after World War I, Tchaikovsky published a book on cycle theory. The title might not have been destined to make the book a smash hit, but it might take a big breath away before you finished reading the last word. The title was Investigation of the Relationship Between the Sunspot Activity and the Course of the Universal Historical Process from 5th Century BC to the Present. Wow. Tchaikovsky did prove that humans became more excited every 11 years, which corresponds to the known 11-year sunspot cycle. He gathered data from 72 nations from 500 BC to 1922. Throughout this period of 2,422 years, he included such factors of human excitability as wars, riots, revolutions, expeditions, that's important, like people going out and finding new land, and migrations. He took into consideration the magnitude of the event, the size of the area affected, and the number of people involved. The charts that are reproduced here give a very interesting cyclical view of human activity, which you could call emotion or excitability. So here's the human excitability cycle. This is Tchaikovsky's original art, 5th century BC, and he's showing the behavior of history as he analyzed it, which again fits with this 11-year periodicity of what we would expect the sunspot cycle to be back then, even though we can't really see it because we don't have the data. But then it goes right up to the 20th century, and it's very, very consistent. So the Tchaikovsky cycle, once again, Armstrong covers the same topic, indicates that every 11-year cycle period, according to Dewey at least, could be broken into 4 distinct periods. Period number 1 is 3 years long. It's marked by peace, passiveness, and general rule by minority groups. Again, this is where bad things start to happen. Period 2 has a duration of 2 years in which general excitability grows from political unrest. New ideas or concepts emerge which tend to challenge the party in control. These ideas become popular answers to present-day problems, but there is a definite lack of a uniting force. In period number 3, and I added some of these slides myself. This is not exactly quoted from the material. I'm summarizing what the paper says. In period number 3, the public's voice is heard. Brave new leaders emerge. This is what we're under right now since 2020. Okay? And under a dictatorship, this has been the strongest period of mass riots and revolutions in which the major problems in society are then solved. At times, anarchy does prevail, but generally, democratic reforms are gained. So, brave new leaders emerge beginning in period number 3. And this is exactly what we've been seeing with the pillow guy and with the general, who everybody now knows and loves, and with the lawyer, Sidney, and many others. The Arizona State Senator, Wendy. And I go on and on from there. So, these people are now prominently driving forward this narrative, which is essentially proving that what happened is fraudulent and it needs to be fixed. And so the will of the people will not be suppressed. And so again, going back to the slide, during this period of time, we're going to see mass riots, revolutions, but major problems are solved and democratic reforms are gained. That is what's happening now, and we're still in it. And it's going to continue through 2022. So we can expect many, many amazing things to be happening during this time. And then period number 4, as we already heard, is when everybody kind of wears out. The excitability declines. They go along contented, but they're apathetic. Peace movements are usually generated during this period. The masses do have prosperity. They go about back into normal life, awaiting the sun to set and the new light of dawn, which brings the beginning of a new cycle. This is what he said. So we got, again, period number 1, 3 years of peace and passivity. Period number 2, 2 years of excitability and unrest without a unifying force. That was right up until 2020. And you could see that for sure. And then period number 3 is unification, revolution, and reform. And that's the phase we're in right now. We're just about halfway through the 3-year period, and then we get into contentment and apathy. So as I've said, this is a story that has a beginning, middle, and ending, the cycles of history, setup, conflict, and resolution. So I've talked a lot about the cycles of history in my books. And so the 11-year cycle of the sun, if you break it up into 4 pieces, That's just a really simplified view of the hero's journey. So the hero's journey is what I've argued, the mind of the galaxy is driving us through a blueprint of experiences that we need to have in order to get spiritually enlightened. So it's like a template for human evolution. And interestingly enough, this pattern shows up in mythologies all over the world. In other words, people have a dream or they get a vision, or maybe some type of extraterrestrial came and visited them and gives them these stories which they then tell about a hero who goes on a quest. And so it's a typical Hollywood movie type of story. And especially after George Lucas used Joseph Campbell's research into all this, Joseph Campbell compared many, many, many different cultures all around the world and found that each one of them in their mythologies is telling this one single story over and over and over. And they're not connected to each other, so how the hell do they know how to tell the story? So Joseph Campbell took the ideas of Dr. Carl Jung and said that the hero's journey is the grand summary of all the archetypes that Dr. Carl Jung was saying that exist. If you take all the archetypes and put them together, we have to go through all of these in the course of this story, in the course of the hero's journey. So there's 3 phases to it. There's setup, conflict, and resolution. And so the hero's journey plays out every 11 years with the sun. Okay, check this out. So again, we have, it's a story that has a beginning, middle, and ending. That's the basic idea of the hero's journey. You set up the story. The hero goes into conflict with the villain. The hero has to face off against the villain. And then there's a resolution. Well, this is precisely the same as the 4-part solar cycle formula. Number 1 is peace, which leads to unrest, which riles people up and gets them all activated, and then they have a victory, and there's all these, great things that occur, and then we move into contentment, and this is where the scientific breakthroughs start to happen after the war's over. So unfortunately, though, typically when we get to contentment, we lead to apathy. Apathy leads to bad boundaries in the new peace period, and then we get unrest again in period number 2 as a result of these bad boundaries. Once again, we have to defeat them, we get a victory, and then our apathy returns again. As I said, this is the wheel of karma in the law of one, and their key advice is that in forgiveness lies the stoppage of the wheel of karma. So by forgiving those who have hurt you the most, while also exercising your healthy boundaries, in forgiveness, you don't have to go down into apathy. You don't have to go down into your life sucking again. As I said, your life sucking, Okay, so everything is leading up to a grand finale. Back to the slide real quick, just to make that point. And we are now in that part of the sunspot cycle where we're supposed to get everything that we, back to the camera, everything that we think we're going to get, everything that we want to have in society to make this world better. It's all happening now. So if you think that the usual suspects are just going to keep doing what they always do for the next few years, that is not true. I mean, the sunspot cycle essentially forbids it from happening. The sunspot cycle requires there to be a massive, massive overthrow of negativity at this time. And then what's even more interesting than that is that not only do we have the 11-year sunspot cycle, which again has the hero journey chopped up into 4 pieces, You got peace, unrest, revolution, and then contentment. So that 4-part cycle is only taking place over the course of 11 years, but one would argue that the 25,000-year cycle would have the same pattern again based on all these ancient teachings. And I'm not going to get into all the proof of this now, but it is very, very extensive. Essentially, all of the historical cycles that I discovered are subdivisions of the 25,000 years. And I'll say 25,000 just to keep it simple. I know that it's 25,920 years, but I'll say 25,000. So, okay, for example, if you look at the age of the zodiac, it's 2,160 years long, and there's 12 of them in the 25,000 years. So you take 2160 times 12, you get 25,920 years. So each individual age of the zodiac, which is, we've been studying these ages of the zodiac and keeping track of them since the dawn of history. The very, very beginning of all human life on Earth, we already had the ages of the zodiac, and they were clearly defined, correlated with constellations, correlated with animals, etc. Well, what I discovered in my second book, The Synchronicity Key, is that the 2,160-year cycle perfectly reiterates historical events. They overlap with each other. So events that happen in Roman history then reiterate in American history 2,160 years later. This is a big topic. It's outside the scope of what I can do today. I have talked about it before. I did talk about it in Gateway to Galactic Mind a little bit. And I might do some more of this as time goes on. So just to make that point alone, there's some kind of very strange thing that's overlapping history 2,160 years apart, and it's amazingly precise. Hitler shows up in Carthaginian history, that was the enemy of Rome, as Hannibal. They look identical. Hannibal has a beard, Hitler has a little mustache, but their faces look the same. They invade the same lands with the same military war strategies in the exact same years in history. And then when you look at Watergate, as Nixon is thrown out of office, it perfectly corresponds exactly 2,160 years before with an almost identical scandal where Scipio Africanus was thrown out because he was caught bribing the enemy to extend the war for his own political power, which again, Nixon was extending Vietnam for his own political power. So it's basically the same thing. And there's so many of these, and they're so amazing that, again, I had to write a whole book about it, and I've really still not done the definitive filmic treatment of all this data because it's vast and it takes a long time to make all those slides because this is very, very intricate stuff. Anyway, the only reason I'm bringing this up at all is that if there's cycles of history that are extremely precise, sometimes almost down to the day, across a gulf of 2,160 years, that implies that the 2,160-year cycle itself is like a hero's journey that has peace, unrest, revolution, and contentment. And it implies that the whole entire 25,000-year cycle, because the sun is correlated with consciousness, because it creates creativity, because it creates wars and revolutions and economic collapse, it's probably not just doing it over the course of 11 years. It's probably also doing it over the course of 2160 years, and it's probably doing it over the course of 25,000 years. When you then go back into sources like the Law of One, what do they tell us about the 25,000-year cycle? They say that at the end of the cycle is the culmination of everything that humanity needs to learn. So at the end of the cycle, we get a global initiation. We get a global dark night of the soul. It's happening right now. And we have a mass consciousness effect where everybody is faced with the same problems at the same time. And I was expecting this, but we'd never really seen anything where the whole world has to deal with the same thing at the same time until COVID in 2020. That's when we all started to go through a collective timeline, that we're all on the same timeline. I believe now, as I've started to understand this more, and then I've looked at some of these readings that I got, which we're going to talk about momentarily, I'm now convinced that the story that we're in right now, the story that we're all going through collectively, that is the big plan. That is the big global event that synergizes the world through trauma and crisis. Okay, we're in that global crisis. The whole world is dealing with an attack. The whole world is having protests. The whole world is very upset. And we've never seen anything like this before. There's never been a singular global problem, a singular global enemy. There's never been a singular global dark night of the soul. And so again, my argument is that this is not random. This is actually cyclical. It's a cyclical change. So this is where I was up until a couple of days ago, and this was the show I was going to give you, and I thank you for watching. This is David Wilcock, and we'll see you next time.